Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of Talking About Socialism from a Marxist Point of View. Tonight, we've got a discussion on the French Revolution. It's part of our regular fortnightly meetings where we discuss contemporary historical and theoretical issues related to the struggle for socialism stroke communism. This evening, we're very pleased, I'm particularly pleased to have John Bulaitis, who I'll introduce in a moment. My name is Nick Rack. I'm going to be chairing this evening's meeting. The meeting itself is going to be recorded. It's now being recorded and it will appear on YouTube. So take that into account when you make any comments. And if you wish, have your video turned off. John, I'm particularly pleased to invite. John and I first met, I think, 46 years ago. My goodness, in 1979, when I moved to London, and John was at that time a full-timer and the regional secretary of the Militant. And John recruited me to the Militant. I don't know whether to thank him or not. Anyway, without further ado, John is going to introduce, for 20 or so minutes, a discussion or an introduction on the French Revolution. I'm sure you all know that today, the 14th of July, is Bastille Day, one of the great events that inaugurated the French Revolution back in 1789. John is now retired, but was for 15 years a lecturer specializing in history and in French history at the University of Christchurch in Canterbury. He's written several very good books. One, a biography of Maurice Thorez, the leader of the French Communist Party. And just recently, he's had a new book published, The Tithe War in England and Wales, which has just won a prize, the Joan Thirsk Memorial Prize. So I'd encourage you to have a look at both of those. I've not read the new one, but the one on Maurice Thorez is excellent. Without going into any more details, I'm going to invite John to outline his talk. And please, even if you don't know very much about the French Revolution or next to nothing, don't hold back with your questions. John's here and he'll do what he can, the best he can to answer any questions that you've got. So, John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Nick, and good evening, comrades. It's good to be with you. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. If anyone throws some questions into the chat, I'll try and answer them. I'm going to keep this rather spontaneous. I have got some notes and a general structure, but I noticed there's a podcast called "The Rest Is History." By actually two quite right-wing historians run this podcast. It's not bad at times, but they had about 21-hour episodes on the French Revolution. So you can see trying to get this into 20 minutes is problematic. And thanks, Stephen, for I think it's a quote from Henry IV, is it not? I don't know if that's the relevance of that to the French Revolution, but perhaps the sentiments are there. Now I've got a few slides, and I'm going to start off with a picture of a meeting between Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in 1971. Now this was a visit by Henry Kissinger, who was then Richard Nixon's national security advisor. And he visited China on a secret trip that would pave the way for the historic visit by Richard Nixon in the following year. And the story goes that Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai what he believed was the historical significance of the French Revolution. And Zhou Enlai replied, so the story goes, the historical significance? Surely it's too soon to say. Now, I say it's a story because it now seems very likely that the topic of conversation was the mass workers and students movement of 1968. But I can well imagine Dao Enlai, a revolutionary leader well versed in European history, someone who studied in Paris in the early 1920s, making such a statement. And some historians claim that he made this statement, that it was even 200 years on, too early to understand fully the historical significance of the French Revolution. And, in other words, the French Revolution was not an ordinary historical event. The French themselves have this term, um, uh, excuse me, I'm trying to work out how my slides work. As someone put a thumbs up if it has changed. Oh yes, okay. Um, the French have this term, a meta-événement. In other words, what they mean is a series of events, each in themselves of enormous importance, but taken together have epoch-defining consequences. The Spanish Civil War was a meta event. The Russian Revolution was a meta event. And the French Revolution was a meta event. Today is the anniversary of the 14th of July, the Bastille Day. But the revolution lasted over 10 years. And it was a revolution that laid the foundations for social, political, and cultural relations throughout the 19th century and for much of the 20th century. If you think about it, most of the modern isms, liberalism, nationalism, conservatism, you could even add feminism, I think, all of them have their roots in the French Revolution. The very notions of left and right come from the French Revolution, where the left were the more radical wing in the National Convention, and the right, the more moderate wing, sat on the right. And I think you can say the roots of communism are also in the French Revolution. 1792 was the first Paris Commune, where there were elected body representing 48 of the sections of Paris, and it was dominated by what became known as the sans-culottes, without breeches, the representatives of the popular masses, and they pushed for radical measures. In 1796, we had the conspiracy of equals, led by a man who took a Roman revolutionary, if you like, Gracchus as his first name, Gracchus Babeuf, who stood for the equal distribution of land and incomes. And the French Revolution was the model. It was the seedbed, I think, the seedbed for the revolutionary Marxist tradition. It was the model for Russian revolutionaries. Marx himself, Marx and Engels, it's no accident, I think, that the final words of the Communist Manifesto, "Workers have nothing to lose but their chains," are an echo of the words of Rousseau, who, for Robespierre, one of the great leaders of the revolution, Rousseau was his guiding light. Rousseau said, "Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains." And Marx and Engels quite consciously echoed that phrase in the Communist manifestos. The Russian Revolution the Russian revolutionaries saw their revolution through the optic of the French Revolution. In 1917, revolutionaries saw the revolution as a logical continuation of the French Revolution. And the debates in Russian Marxism were framed by an understanding of that revolution. A bit early on in his political career, before he joined the Bolsheviks, Trotsky described Lenin as Maximilian Lenin, after Maximilian Robespierre. And later, of course, he used concepts of Thermidor, which I'll mention in a minute, and Bonapartism in his analysis of Stalinism. And I think even today, many of the concepts we use, an understanding, for example, of a way a revolutionary process unfolds, the way the masses can become tired and worn out and disappointed and betrayed, if you like, and the impact of that. All of these are rooted in an understanding of the processes which took place in the French Revolution. Now, what I'm going to do now, I think, is first of all, I'm going to summarize the main landmarks of the revolution, because I don't think, even amongst socialists, they are sufficiently known. And we can divide the revolution into three main stages. So I'm going to do that. And then fourthly, I'm going to just make some comments about interpretations, about how the revolution is interpreted today. And then we can get on and discuss it. So three stages. The first stage, July 1789 to July 1792. And the key moment is, of course, the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July. This was an insurrection. It was an insurrection by the popular masses of Paris, and it led to the collapse of the ancien regime, the old regime, the regime and state dominated by the monarchy, nobility, and the church. That regime had been living through a crisis of economic form, of a financial crisis, an internal political decay. And the crisis had forced the king to convene a meeting of what was called the États Généraux, the Estates General, at Versailles, a medieval institution made up of 1/3 of the nobility, from the nobility, 1/3 from the church, and 1/3 representing everybody else. And the 1/3 representing everybody else became known as the Third Estate. It was mainly professional classes, business classes, representative of merchants. They declared themselves a national assembly and took an oath that they would not disperse until France got a constitution. And their arguments were permeated by the ideas of the Enlightenment, the idea that a nation should be decided, the needs of a nation could be decided by the general will, an idea of Rousseau, not by a monarch. And today, this was the beginning of the term national sovereignty, which today, of course, we hear in the Brexit debate, and we hear Keir Starmer talking about it in relation to citizens of a country of strangers, and keeping out asylum seekers and so on. The origin of this term was that a nation should be made up of citizens who lived on its territory and accept its laws. And during the revolution, Thomas Paine, who wrote The Rights of Man, who was an English revolutionary who played a role in the Great American Revolution as well, was back in England, had written a book called The Rights of Man, and he was being hunted down for arrest by the English authorities, and he fled to France as an asylum seeker, to faced with arrest, and he fled to France, and he was elected to the National Convention. And he took part in the debates of the National Convention, even though he could not speak a word of English. So national sovereignty basically means that a sovereign power in a nation should be in the hands of an organized nation, the citizens of the nation. And at the time, it meant to be a citizen, you lived on the territory and you accepted the constitution, accepted the rules of that nation. Now, the face of this revolution, the Queen, the nobility attempted to mobilize a counter-revolution, a mercenary army to seize power back from the assembly, and that is which prompted the revolutionary crowds in Paris beginning to search for weapons and gunpowder to prevent a coup by the monarchy. 8,000 people surrounded and besieged the Bastille, the symbol of the power of the regime. the place where people arrested under the what was called the lettre de cachet, a bit like Donald Trump's ICE, where people could be arrested and taken off the streets and disappear. It was the place they would be taken, but it was above all garrison and an arsenal. And they stormed the Bastille and took the Bastille, a symbol of royal power. Now, like the February Revolution in Russia, this insurrection was not planned. It had no recognized leaders. In that sense, some use the term it was spontaneous, but we know they were leaders. Of course, there's always leaders, and we know who many of them were. There was a list compiled of 662 names of people who took part in the storming of the Bastille. 48 of them were cabinet makers. 41 of them were locksmiths. 28 of them were cobblers. 10 of them were hairdressers. There was a cook, a man called Denot, became famous because he struck down the governor of the garrison. In fact, there was 30 different trades. What we're talking about are the crafts people, the proto-proletariat, if you like. It's wrong to call them a proletariat, the proto-proletariat of Paris, people who were later become known as the sans-culottes. And at the same time as this was happening, revolution was sweeping the countryside. Peasants were refusing to pay their dues to the nobility, their tithes to the church. Feudal registers were being burnt in village squares. And there was, in other words, the complete collapse of royal authority and the royal state. And the National Assembly now had complete authority. A new city government was established in Paris. And the National Assembly carries out a series of far-reaching measures. Some of them I've put there on the screen. The important point is that the aim of this first stage of the revolution was a constitutional monarchy. Their model was the system in England, but it was you could say a dual power situation. The power of the old regime had collapsed, although the king still existed, and a new power was now organized. And yet the new power did not want to take over from the old power. I will speed up a little bit. There are many contradictions, of course, in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. That declaration has world implications. It's been the foundation for the Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, the European Convention of Human Rights. But of course, the rights and equality were limited. They did not apply to slaves. They did not apply to women. And one of the features of this stage in the revolution is the role of women, the way women actively intervened. The most clear example was the March on Versailles in October 1789, where they marched to Versailles and brought the king back to Paris so he could be kept under the eye of the popular masses. Now, that's the first stage of the revolution. The second stage of the revolution, you could say, is how dual power is resolved. And the key moment was on 10th of August 1792, a new insurrection. In my view, probably more important than the 14th of July 1789. 20,000 armed Parisians surrounded the Tuileries Palace. Today, you know, the Louvre, the museum in the center of Paris. And this time it wasn't spontaneous. It was organized by the newly formed Commune of Paris, made up of representatives of the different sections. It was a more bloody affair as well. 600 Swiss guards were killed. But it was an insurrection to defend the revolution from attack, both internally and externally. In June 1791, the king had tried to flee France and made a declaration against the revolution. Big landowners had left France and formed an alliance with European powers, particularly Austria and Prussia. England, Holland, and Spain would soon join in a military campaign to overthrow the new government. And there was also rebellion in pockets of France, particularly in the Vendée and parts of the Pyrenees. And that insurrection of the 10th of August led to the formation of the National Convention, elected by universal manhood, suffrage. But by early 1793, the revolution was in the balance. And now we come to the stage of the revolution most associated with Maximilian Robespierre. The revolution's in the balance. Foreign troops are occupying the south and the northeast of the country, and counter-revolutionaries are publishing lists of people they're going to execute if they take power. The Duke of Brunswick, who is the leader of the Prussian army, is threatening to burn Paris to the ground when they enter Paris. And the threat of the counter-revolution leads to growing support for radical measures to defend the revolution within the National Assembly. And it's here now that the left wing, led by the Jacobins, led by Maximilian Robespierre, takes the leadership of the revolution, and they have the support of the popular masses of Paris and the other major cities. A republic is declared, the king is put on trial. We have the mobilization of a new type of army, 1.5 million people under arms. The Marseillaise, the French national anthem, has its origins in that new type of army. But a number of revolutionary decrees are also announced. A Republican education program, social welfare, rights for children, the abolition of slavery, a de-Christianization program, and the fate of the supreme being is perhaps one of the most radical measures. And that phase of the revolution also includes what becomes known as the Terror, which begins with a rather grisly affair when the prisoners in the prisons in Paris are slaughtered in an affair known as the September massacres. Revolutionary tribunals and the Committee of Public Safety and the law of suspects are introduced, and counter-revolutionaries are charged and put to death without a proper trial. 14,000 people were sentenced to death by these tribunals. Most of the executions, the peak takes place between December 93 and January 1944. But more controversially, I think perhaps, is the executions continue, and by the summer of 1794, leaders of the revolution, erstwhile leaders of the revolution like Danton and Jacques Hébert, the leader of the radical wing of the revolution, are also put to death, are guillotined. We might come back to the Terror. It's one of the controversial aspects and perhaps one of the more difficult aspects of the revolution that Marxists have to deal with. But I'm going to have to speed up because I've had 20 minutes and I've got two more points to make, because we've got the third stage of the revolution is what became known as Thermidor, July 1794, November 1799. Why it's called Thermidor is because one of the radical measures of the revolution is they brought in a new calendar to abolish the Christian calendar. And so the third phase of the revolution, the overthrow and then the execution of Robespierre and his supporters, takes place on the 9th of Thermidor, the 27th of July, 1794. What follows now is a White Terror, arrests and assassinations of the Jacobin leaders, steps to reverse the radical measures of the revolution. From the new Declaration of the Rights, the paragraph, an essential paragraph, is excluded, that which says people are born free and equal in rights. And there's a number of new insurrections now. The Song Cannot rise up in May 1795 in order to defeat this counter-revolution. And 4,000 of them are stripped of their citizenship and transported to concentration camps in the Seychelles and other French colonies. But then the royalists then make an attempt at a revolution. And it's put down, this is in 5th of October 1795, put down by the army, who the commanding officer of whom is Napoleon Bonaparte. And then there's a further insurrection from the left in 1796, led by Glucas Babeuf, I've already mentioned, which becomes known as the Conspiracy of Equals. But basically, what begins to happen is a concentration of power, first of all, into the hands of 5 people known as the Directory, And policies are now explicitly designed for the merchant and the business classes rather than for the popular masses. But it's a government of crisis that is increasingly relying on the army, both against the popular movement, but also against potential royalist reaction. And it's that which paves the way for the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who took power in a military coup in 1799. So you could say counter-revolution triumphed because Napoleon declared himself an emperor. He transformed a war of revolutionary defense into a war driven by power politics and territorial gain. And eventually in 1815, the monarchy was restored. But I think this is the important point. The reaction did not overturn the social basis of the revolution. There was no going back to the monarchist state and the social relations of the ancien regime. So my final point is this. How do we interpret these events? And I'm speaking here as someone as a historian rather than a political activist at this point, because I'm looking at what professional historians have written about the revolution. And for most of the 20th century, the dominant account was heavily influenced by socialist and Marxist ideology. A key early text was by Jean Jaurès, who was the leader of the French Socialist Party at the beginning of the 20th century. But the most important historian in France was Albert Soboul. In Britain, a British historian, George Roudet, also is an important contributor. These last two historians were both members of the Communist Party. Their interpretation stressed the positive aspects of the revolution and described it as a victory of the bourgeoisie over feudal relations. However, these interpretations also served the interests of the French Communist Party, because Soboul was able to argue that the revolution was carried through by a coalition of the bourgeoisie, the peasantry, and the popular masses. And this idea of unity between the different social classes was to defend democracy and republicanism, served as the theoretical support for the Communist Popular Front policy. Now, this is the final slide. The challenge to the social interpretation begins in the 1960s. And this actually comes from within the Marxist tradition. Francois Furet was a Communist Party member who left the Communist Party in 1956 at the time of the Hungarian uprising, and drifted towards the left via social democracy and Maoism into right-wing politics. And his interpretation was extremely powerful. It saw the revolution not as class struggle, but as a political struggle for a constitutional monarchy and liberal constitution. And in 1792, it skidded off course, leading to the collapse of the monarchy and the bloodshed of the terror. The truth is, without 1792, without the new revolution in August 1792, the counter-revolution would have been successful, and the whole revolution would have been skidded off course and drowned in blood. Now, Furet moved further towards the right, and with the collapse of Stalinism, he wrote of the terror being the precursor of the Gulag, and how Stalinism was the inevitable outcome of Marxism and so on. You're using it as a justification the French Revolution. Similar sort of ideas. This book in the middle, Simon Sharma, came out in 1989, was a big bestseller. You saw it in the front windows of Waterstones and so on. And his argument was that from the outset, the revolution was unnecessary, as the nobility was evolving to a more enlightened form of rule, and violence was intrinsically part of the revolution from the outset and the central truth of the revolution. It wasn't just an unfortunate side effect, it was the revolution's source of collective energy. And his book is full of grisly accounts of the violence. Some of it is pretty horrific, but this is someone horrified at the violence of the oppressed whilst ignoring the violence of the oppressor. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that there were less people killed each day in the terror than are being killed each day by the Israeli army in Gaza at the moment. Today, leading historians stressed the revolution was a political upheaval rather than an event that ushered in fundamental socialist change. There's arguments that the bourgeoisie did not really exist as a class at that stage, and you can't describe it as a bourgeois revolution. I was going to make some more points, but I, I think I will stop there. I might come back to those in questions. I was going to make a couple of points about what some of the founders of the revolutionary Marxist tradition said about the um, the revolution, but I think I'll leave it there, quite open, and hand back to you, Nick, to see if there's any questions on what I've been saying. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, John. If you could stop sharing, that would be great. Wow, that was a breathless take through the revolutionary events, John. Really conveyed the excitement of it, I have to say, and definitely is sending me back to my books. I'm going to open it up for discussion now. Can I just say, I forgot to mention earlier, anybody watching this on YouTube, please press the subscribe button and the like button so that you get informed of other talking about socialism videos. We normally try to keep people to 3 minutes, but it may be that that's not long enough in these circumstances. But if you've got brief questions, don't hesitate. There's so much to ask about and so much to discuss. So I'm going to open it up. I've got Edmund Potts, and please raise your hand using the yellow hand at the bottom of your page, or wave if you can't see it. So, Ed.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks very much to John as well. Yeah, so much ground covered there. I think I just wanted to ask really about something that you touched on in a couple of ways, which is the reasons why the French Revolution seems exciting and unusual to us, perhaps even compared to other comparable revolutions from this period, because I think the way that it's commonly remembered by historians or people of whatever political persuasion is a period of excesses, and of course John referred to the excesses of the terror, revolutionary violence. I think it would be interesting to hear more about that, and of course John very well sort of put it in context, both for the time and in relation to the violence that we see pervading the world at the moment. But it seems to me there are also excesses in terms of the way that the revolutionary movement and population experimented and did things that went beyond what was strictly necessary in order to achieve what you might think of as the fundamental tasks of the revolution, dismantling the absolutist regime and so on, because John referred to, of course, the new calendar. Certainly hard to imagine that was strictly necessary to decimalize weeks, so that they were 10 days instead of 7, but nonetheless people spent time doing that and committed to it. Cult of reason, state-sponsored atheism to try and replace Catholicism, perhaps didn't last very long, but again, something that you might think that you can tackle clericalism and tackle the power of the church without going beyond that and then creating some kind of new state-sponsored atheist or deist religion. And I'm sure there are other examples of things like that as well. So I was just interested in John's thought about that as to why it had all of these perhaps unusual features that maybe other so-called bourgeois revolutions, if that's still a useful term, didn't have necessarily, and whether those unusual outgrowths and features are connected with the class content of the revolution itself, and how meaningful that was, whether it was more political or whether it was going hand in hand with a change in social and economic relations. So I hope that made sense. But thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Do we have any other people who want to put their hands up? John, we've got a question in the chat from Jeff Barr. Do you have any comments about the impact of the revolution on the left in Britain? I'm assuming that Jeff means at the time of the French Revolution, although I may be mistaken about that. Obviously, the French Revolution had a massive impact internationally and in Britain, politically and in terms of literature and art and so on. Whilst John's thinking about that, can I just see any other? Soraya?
Yeah, I can see that Barry's got his hand up, Nick.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I don't get everybody across the top of my screen, so that's helpful. Barry?
John, I just wanted you to, I wondered whether you would expand on your, on the ending of your talk when you were talking about the nature of a bourgeois revolution, what we understand by bourgeois revolution. Does it mean a revolution led by the industrial bourgeoisie taking over from the feudal regime? Does it mean, or does it mean a revolution led by sections of the capitalist class, or does it mean consequentialism? That is to say, it's a revolution that clears the way to capitalism, removes the obstacles to capitalism, and the outcome is the consolidation of capitalism. On that point about going beyond what is strictly necessary, surely it's not about some abstract yardstick from the outside, some abstract understanding of what the course of the revolution should take. But as John tried to do, I think you have to look at the revolution in terms of the concrete circumstances as they arrive, because men make history, but not under the circumstances of their own choosing. So I think it's a wrong approach to say, oh, that wasn't necessary, surely. Because then you're into the theory that the revolution skidded out of control. And instead of having a gradual, peaceful or evolutionary process of liberal democracy, there was all this excesses or excess. Just a final point, you did mention Trotsky and the Bolsheviks using the French Revolution as a model. I think early in his career, the young Trotsky was very critical of other Russian Marxists because they were using analogies from the French Revolution to understand the course of the Russian Revolution. And he said that that was inadequate. It was better to study the actual dynamics of the revolution itself rather than use journalistic analogies from the French Revolution. But then again, himself, after 1917, was the most prominent one to use analogies from the French Revolution. And those analogies about the rise of Stalinism confused things, as he later admitted, or almost admitted. He never admitted mistakes, of course. But I think in the early 20s, many of the oppositionists were saying, Thermidor, it's already taking place in the 1920s in Russia. And then Trotsky denied that. And he said it wasn't Thermidor. And then 10 or 12 years later, he looked back and said, well, yeah, it was Thermidor in the 1920s. So he kind of muddled the waters by using analogies with the French Revolution. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Barry. Very interesting questions. Okay, Stephen Sutton.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think what so in the chat I actually asked a question saying that arguably the French Revolution was the birth of nationalism. So I'd like to expand on that a little bit. I'm going to go a little bit further, so I'm not simply asking the question. So obviously, the first states emerged thousands of years ago, but nationalism only took shape in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's not some sort of something that's eternal, or as many may assume these days. Nationalism is a modern ideology, part and parcel of the bourgeois political revolution. And I think it was the French Revolution, 1789, which came to symbolize this new national consciousness. I think point 3 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen stated, the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. So power was no longer to be held exclusively in the hands of the nobility and the clergy. It was now the citizens of the nation who would govern. Obviously, that was the ideal, but who got to be a citizen was a different matter. But I think I'm gonna go a little bit further than this. I think that a dividing line between those who claim to be revolutionaries today is the question of nationalism. So this ideology is the basis of capitalist ideology. It's the glue that holds the classes together. It's an artificial construct, but it's one which still retains great power. For some Marxists, nationalism still retains validity. So they speak about the nationalism of the oppressed as being valid and worthy of support. For other Marxists, nationalism has no progressive content whatsoever in this day and age, in the imperialist period. So this latter trend, or this latter perspective, the rejection of nationalism in the modern period, the rejection of nationalism of any stripe, the rejection of support for national liberation movements, self-determination, it tends to be little known in the UK, despite the reputation of one of its main proponents, Rosa Luxemburg. So I'm going to put it to you that the nationalism which arose with the French Revolution and was an important part for decades in the emergence of various nation states, no longer has any progressive content. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Interesting points. Can I see who else might want to come in? And remember, questions are welcome. There are no daft questions. There must be lots and lots of questions that people are wanting to know about. And in the absence of any hands, I'm going to ask a couple for John, and I'm going to ask. There's a few points already, John, for you to come back on. I've just been looking at Eric Hazan's book, The People's History of the French Revolution, and he makes the point early on. One of the points that you were making, he suggests that the question about whether it was a bourgeois revolution or not is a redundant question that he refuses to answer. But he seems to be saying that there was no bourgeois class at the time. So perhaps you could develop that point, the one that you made in your opening. The sans-culotte as I understand it, that was a name that was ascribed to the masses as a sort of derogatory, denigratory term, and they took it with pride and used it as a badge of honor in a sense. But could you just go into a little bit more about what comprised the sans-culottes? Because it seems to be quite a broad range of different jobs or classes, not classes, but different range of incomes, I suppose. The commune, which obviously has great importance for Marxists because of Marx's writings on the 1871 commune. The Paris commune of that era has its origins in the French Revolution. And I just wondered if you could perhaps go into a little bit about how that came about, because as I understand it, there was no legal commune. The Paris masses created a commune of their own early on in the revolution, and then it was sanctioned. I'm interested in that, and not to overload you, come back at these at the end if you don't have time. It might be interesting for people to know a little bit about the clubs and the political clubs, so like the Jacobins, the Girondists, and what they represented, if you can. And then there's been some discussion in the chat I raised about Jeff Barr. If there's no other questions at the moment, are there any questions at the moment? If not, I'm going to ask John to come back on some of those and the ones that were asked earlier on. So, John, if you'd like to come back on, I've thrown quite a lot at you.
Am I on?
Yes.
Coming over?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, where to start with? Where to start with all that? Yeah, very good questions, and really some really good discussion there. The international impact of the revolution. The question that who John asked about what was the impact of the revolution in Britain. I didn't deal with the international impact of the revolution, and I think that's something that we really have to stress. Probably something that the French revolutionaries themselves did not understand. The Russian revolutionaries understood that their revolution would fail if it didn't spread internationally, but the French revolutionaries had a very national perspective, I think, to what they were trying to achieve. But the revolution had a colossal impact in Britain. The London Corresponding Club and various other proto trade union type working class political organizations began to get formed almost immediately. But you could trace its ideology. The Peterloo uprising, for example, is permeated with the ideas of the French Revolution. If you look at the banners and even the clips of liberty that they wore, and you can trace the legacy of the Peterloo uprising all the way into the early British Labour movement. So I think the British Labour movement has got its, it draws from the heritage. You can have a genealogical tree, if you like, which links the French Revolution to the British Labour movement. But probably more important is the impact it had amongst oppressed peoples throughout other countries in the world. I mean, look at Latin America in the early part of the 19th century. Once, the struggle against the Spanish rule was undoubtedly given impetus by the French Revolution, and perhaps most heroically the struggle of the slaves in Saint Dominique, the French colony now known as Haiti, where initially the French Revolution didn't abolish slavery, but an uprising by the slaves in 1791, a vicious regime, a heroic a struggle, led to not only the reversal of that policy on slavery, but led to the first independent colonial free state out, from a slave owning state. So the international impact is something to stress. I'm not going to try and answer all the questions, but I think I'll come back on, one which a number of you have sort of hinted at and raised explicitly. I think Barry asked explicitly, the bourgeois revolution, is it a useful term? And tie this in with what Ed was saying about, did things go further than necessary? And if so, why? Well, I think it is a useful term, but it doesn't mean the bourgeois led a revolution. This is, I think, the something that Marxists sometimes find hard to get their heads around. Is there such a thing as a classic bourgeois revolution led by the industrial bourgeois? Does such a thing exist? In my opinion, it doesn't. Even in the classic revolution, the classic bourgeois revolution, the French Revolution, bourgeois were prepared to compromise with the old state, with the nobility, with the monarchy. And I think it was Marx himself who actually said that the bourgeois revolution was carried through. It was carried through by Robespierre and the Jacobins, by mobilizing the popular masses and without the direct participation of the bourgeoisie. And in fact, some writers, both Engels and Trotsky, I think, went further when they said it was carried through against the bourgeoisie. I mean, the representatives of the bourgeoisie in the National Convention were the Girondists, who went to the guillotine during the terror for advocating policies that were in effect a compromise with the old regime. So I think even in the classic bourgeois revolution, the motor of the revolution was the popular masses, and the bourgeoisie couldn't be relied upon to carry through their own revolution. And I think that's been the lesson of history since the French Revolution as well. I mean, the point though about why did it go? Did it skid out of control? Did it go too far? And so, well, some of the things looking back now were clearly pretty crazy. It's partly because of the lack of an international perspective. The point I was making, the point I just made. But I think there's a reason why it took place. The reason why these things took place, the reason why the terror continued. In fact, I mean, the terror. You could argue that. I mean, there's some aspects of the terror which I don't. You just couldn't. You couldn't sit there and say, well, that's that was great. There was some excesses. There were some things that were really, really grisly, really horrific. But I think the key point is that the terror, while the counter-revolution was a threat, there was a justification for the terror. But the terror continued even when the counter-revolution was in a retreat and when there was, really no real basis for it. And it became, and Trotsky, in fact, this is to quote Trotsky, it became a means of self-preservation for Robespierre himself. And I think Trotsky did put his finger on the contradiction within the French Revolution here, because Robespierre and the Jacobins were promoting a egalitarian republic. They were promoting a republic based on equal rights, freedoms, and so on. But it was a republic based on private property and on a system of exploitation by one class over another. In other words, it was absolutely impossible. And again, I'm going to quote Trotsky. He said, the methods of struggle that flowed from this revolutionary contradiction, from this revolutionary utopianism, was such that when they faced having to resolve these gigantic contradictions, they called on the solution of the guillotine. And I think that's, if you like, please put your finger on, you have people trying to introduce equality, liberal society, equal rights, and so on, whilst defending private property and a system of exploitation. I think that's, it helps understand some of the things which took place. Is there anything else? Birth of the revolution was the birth of modern nationalism, without a doubt. Although there were forms of nationalism before the revolution, but the birth of modern nationalism, and nationalism was linked with liberalism. I think it's the important point. After the French Revolution, for a period, nationalism was linked with liberalism, and I think in the major European countries that changed, particularly after 1848. So I think it changes in the latter part of the 19th century. Nationalism becomes increasingly linked with reaction. But I think it's still possible to have nationalism linked with liberalism, where there's a nationalism of the oppressed. I mean, the nationalism of the Palestinian people is a nationalism of the oppressed, and the freedom of Palestine is a demand that all Marxists should get behind. So that differentiation between nationalism of the oppressed and nationalism of the oppressor, I think, is an important point we still have to understand. I'll leave it there, Nick. There's some other questions on my sheets here, but let's see what I can't read. There's a long thing done in the chat, which
yeah, I think it's a side.
Looks like an essay.
It's a side discussion, John. That
all right.
Resurfaces every meeting on the question of the role or not of nationalism. Perhaps going beyond today's discussion. What I'd like to do is to encourage people who are in the meeting to raise any points or raise any questions, ask any questions, however small or minor you think they might be. They will give rise to further discussion. Stephen, I think you put your hand up there.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Great.
So thanks, John, for the talk. It was very, very informative. I had a question regarding essentially the effect of the revolution on the kind of other the colonies of France, essentially, and I guess also in Saint Dominique as well, where obviously this is more well known because of the Black Jacobins, the book by C.L.R. James. I was guessing it would be helpful to sort of, if you could expand on that. And a secondary point, I think you were completely correct about the role of the bourgeoisie in most bourgeois revolutions, in the sense that I think it seems to have been a trend that, generally speaking, there is a tendency for what later, I guess, becomes the kind of big capitalist class to try and essentially negotiate a more favorable position with the kind of existing pre-capitalist formation. I think, for instance, I think there's a significant element of that, from my understanding, in the English Civil War. So yeah, I think that's broadly correct, that bourgeois revolutions are often not led by the bourgeoisie. That's all from me.
Thanks, Stephen.
Nick, can you see Kate has her hand up?
Sorry, no, thanks very much. Kate, fire away.
Yeah, have I unmuted properly?
There you go, thank you.
Yes, okay. Yeah, sorry, my question is just like about nationalism, because the rest of it is all too complicated for me. But I just wanted to ask John what he said about the Palestinians. Does he think the same apply to the Irish struggle? Because what I understood was that was criticised for being only about nationalism. I don't know. Don't really know much about it, but that limited it. And then also about Brexit, because I didn't support Brexit, but I know some people on the left did, and I saw Brexit was kind of partly an issue about nationalism that came from working class people that felt very oppressed. But I felt that it oppressed migrants, because it led to the abolition of free movement in this country? So it's quite a simple question, but I'd just be really interested to know what you think.
Thanks very much, Kate. Anybody else?
Got Toby there, Nick.
Toby's got his hand up, Nick.
Sorry, I can't see any of these on my screen, unfortunately. Toby, all the way from Livorno. Fire away.
I've got the sound, yeah?
Yes?
Yeah, okay. No, I was going to ask John what he thought about Napoleon, in the sense that obviously Napoleon was a reactionary in terms of what he did at home. I mean, that was quite obvious, effectively destroying a republic and replacing it with an empire. That is clearly reactionary. And he changed the divorce law backwards and various other things, not all of which I remember right now. And obviously the slavery, which was something that affected Haiti, he was for the restoration of slavery, not necessarily purely because Josephine came from a slave-owning family from Martinique, but I think that might have contributed to it. But in terms of the Napoleonic armies in the rest of Europe, frequently what they did was to wipe away a feudalism in the countries that they invaded. I'm not saying everywhere, and I know they compromised and all the rest of it, but I mean, it did encourage the spread of the revolution in however distorted a form elsewhere. And I mean, it did lead to, for example, the emancipation of the Jews from the ghettos in the countries that they went to. So, I mean, there is a contradiction. I mean, the analogy I'm aware of, and probably John is too, because Isaac Deutscher came up with this in relation to Stalin and the spread of the of Stalinism to Eastern Europe, and that to some extent you could draw a parallel with Napoleon, that it was both in some respects progressive and so on. Anyway, just what do we think of Napoleon? Do we think he's all bad, or do we think that he had some positive features? I mean, particularly compared with the reactionary nature of the British state at the time, which was, I know, of the Tsarist regime as well, and both of whom were his enemies. I'll leave it at that. I know it's got slightly off the point from the revolution itself, but it is, in a sense, to do with the spread of those revolutionary ideas, or a partial, however distorted, form of them to other countries, which then leads to liberal or radical movements elsewhere in places like Italy in the earlier part of the 19th century.
Thank you very much, Toby. Thank you. Anybody else? And if anybody can point out, because so that Toby's spoken. Anybody else? Barry, you want to come back? Yeah, great.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, just a few more questions. The sans-culottes were the driving force of the revolution, the dynamic of the revolution. But what was the class nature of the sans-culottes? Some people argue that quite a lot of the leaders were master artisans who were bourgeois in a sense, but others stress the kind of well, they couldn't be a proletariat because there was no there wasn't large-scale industrial capitalism in France at the time, so they weren't a proletariat, but they were a kind of embryonic proletariat, if you like, a kind of plebeian element that pushed the revolution beyond the boundaries of a bourgeois revolution. On the question of the influence of the French Revolution, I wonder if you could make a few points about Ireland and the influence on the French Revolution on Irish nationalism and the struggle against the British state, and also the influence of Paine's Rights of Man on radical revolutionaries in Britain following the Russian Revolution. I wonder if you could make a few points about that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Barry. John, you've got a lot of questions there. I'm just scanning to see if anybody wants to ask any final questions or make any final points before I ask John to come back. I'm going to ask another question, John, to add to your mix. How much influence did the American War of Independence, the American Revolution, have on the French events? And coming back to my question about the Commune, are you able to say anything about the question of direct democracy that was raised by the involvement of the sans-culottes in the Commune? If there are no other hands going up, I'm going to ask John to pour 8 gallons into a pint pot.
Yeah, I'm going to pass on quite a lot of the questions, to be honest. They probably require a bit more study, a bit more research. Some of them. I mean, the class nature of the sans-culottes is really interesting. I think it in itself. I think the sans-culottes. I mean, next point actually about how the sans-culottes originally it became a bit like Trotskyist. It was initially a term of abuse, and then it became a sort of badge of honor. But it was a very much a coalition of yes, tradespeople, the artisans, but also day laborers, but also intellectuals. I mean, there was an absolute explosion. When I talk about intellectuals, I mean, some of the sort of professions which were developing at that time, including things like journalism. I mean, at the time in 1789, just after the fall of the Bastille, there was 80 newspapers in France, and that had grown to 2,000 within the matter of about a year. A massive thirst for ideas. People were writing, people were publishing this stuff, and they probably considered themselves sans-culottes as well. So it was a label which covered, I think, a whole range of people. But the actual people who took part in the storming of the Bastille, I mean, we know from research, and we know because at the time, if you took part in it, you could become you could put a sort of badge of honor if you applied to be put on a sort of list, and 662 people did, and we're talking about small craftspeople, small traders, that sort of thing. They were the backbone, and they were the backbone of the Parisian sections, which were set up, which formed the Commune. The sections were elected direct, were democratic sections which were elected and were subject to recall. And they formed the Paris Commune, which led the revolution in August 1792. And those. I'm not using the term proletariat. I mean, I suppose proto-proletariat we could think about using, but I think popular masses is a term I would tend to use. They were the driving force of this revolution at various different stages until I think they ran out of energy, which allowed the Thermidor and the victory of the Directory, and then of Napoleon himself in 1799. The influence of the American Revolution was very important. The French Revolution, in many ways, actually, I mean, it was a factor behind bankrupting the French state because, the ideology of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. If you actually look at the two statements, the rights of man and the statements which were produced during the American Revolution, are very, very similar, and undoubtedly, influenced. The American Revolution was directly influential. Where else are we? What do I think about Napoleon? Well, I think without doubt he was a brilliant military leader. Is there any military conflict in the world before or since which has the name of the main military leader stamped on it? We talk about the Napoleonic Wars. He put his stamp on history, but he was also an egotist. It was the first cult of personality, similar to later, similar to earlier cults of personality like around the Sun King, but also later ones around fascist and Stalinist leaders. And the Napoleonic Wars were a terrible conflict. 2.5 million military deaths, and if you take account the size of the population, that puts it on par with deaths in the First World War. So it's a mixed legacy. But I think Toby's absolutely right in the sense that when the armies went in to into Europe, when he set up his satellite states, the Kingdom of Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Holland, Westphalia, and other states joined his alliance: Bavaria, Saxony, Baden, and so Warsaw, and so on. They didn't. You saw the carrying through, under the bayonets of Napoleon's army, the abolition of feudal relations. So in a distorted way, it was carried through the bourgeois revolution, if you like, in a distorted form, or parts of the bourgeois revolution in a distorted form in those countries. So from that point of view, he has a contradictory legacy. But equally, the fact that his armies were going into countries also prompted the rise of liberal and nationalist movements within those countries as well. That was the case in Spain in particular. So I think Toby's right. It's a mixed, it's a mixed legacy. I think I'll just finish on one last. I think I'll stay out of the argument about Palestine. I'll stay out. Ireland's probably more. I made a comment about Ireland. I mean, the struggle of Irish nationalists against British rule undoubtedly got an impetus and saw the French revolutionaries as their comrades, as their allies, and France saw the Irish nationalists as their allies. So, the Irish struggle, I think, is an example of the way where nationalism, there's a difference between nationalism of the oppressed and nationalism of the oppressor, or people. I mean, national sovereignty, when it as a term, when it arises in 1789, it's the idea of the people running the nation rather than a king or a foreign power. And for me, that's a progressive idea. Of course, it's been distorted and it's changed its meaning, but that, in essence, is a progressive idea which can still apply to some struggles today. But thanks. Sorry, it's been a really interesting discussion. I think I'm going to go away and look at the books again and try and answer some of the questions, particularly that Nick has raised there. But thanks very much for inviting me, and wish you all well with your future projects.
Thanks very much, John. Really enjoyed your introduction, the discussion, and your replies. I thank everybody for attending. Just to give an advert for the next talk organised by Talking About Socialism from a Marxist point of view, and that's in a fortnight's time. which I think is the 28th of July. And there we've got Will McMahon, who's going to be addressing or introducing a discussion on the question of the new party or a new party. I'm sure everybody's aware of the recent developments with the announcement of Zara Sultana. Is there, isn't there going to be a new party? What will it be? What won't it be? Is it going to be democratic? Is it going to be socialist? All these sorts of questions. We've got an article on the TAS website from Janet Sillett, very good article that addresses some of these questions. I hope that you would read that and post your comments to the article. With that, once again, I thank John very much for coming and introducing the discussion. I'll thank everybody else and hopefully see you in a fortnight's time. Good night. Bye-bye.